Okay, I think we'll get started. My name is Dr. Sasha Thomason, and I'm the Animal Facilities Inspection Program Director for the Kansas Department of Ag. And I just want to thank you all for taking the time to join us for this webinar today. For the next 60 minutes, we'll be focusing on the state and local response to rabies and animal bite investigations. This is important to KDA's license holders because I know KDA receives numerous calls each year from licensees asking how to handle these bite cases when a staff member or an animal at the in the facility's care is bitten. A few housekeeping items, though, before we get started. Before the session begins or during the presentation portion, all participant microphones will be muted by the meeting host. So if you have a question during the presentation, please put that in the chat at the bottom of your screen using that chat button. Our staff will be monitoring the chat for questions at the conclusion, and those questions will be asked and answered at the conclusion of the presentation. And this session is being recorded and will be posted online for viewing next week. And so now I'd like to introduce Dr. Petro. Dr. Erin Petro is a state public health veterinarian at the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. In this role, she oversees rabies and zoonotic disease public health surveillance within Kansas, including consulting with and advising program staff, healthcare professionals, veterinarians, livestock and companion animal owners, and the public on various aspects of rabies, vector-borne, and zoonotic disease transmission and control strategies. Prior to joining KDHE, Dr. Petro was in a mixed animal practice in rural Southeast Minnesota. And so now I will turn it over to her to share her presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Thomason, for that warm introduction. Well, I'm really excited to be here with you guys this morning and talk about rabies and animal bite investigations and what that looks like at the state and local level. So we'll go ahead and get started. First, we're going to talk about the rabies virus, the background and epidemiology of it, and why that's important to understand. We'll go into the biology of the rabies virus. I'll discuss pre- and post-exposure vaccination options for both humans and animals. Then we'll get into the public health investigation and response to both animal bites and confirmed positive rabid animals. Then we'll wrap it up by going through some animal bite scenarios, and I'll leave you with some rabies resources at the end. So let's get started with the background and epidemiology of rabies virus. I want to start by giving some context on the global situation of rabies so that you better understand why we spend so much time talking about rabies, following up on animal bites, and considering rabies in animal bite situations. First, rabies is one of the world's deadliest diseases, as it has a nearly 100% fatality rate and is responsible for the death of 59,000 people globally every year. That's one person every 9 minutes, every single day of the year, which means that just during our time together today, 6 people will succumb from the rabies virus. Sadly, about 40% of those deaths are in children, and 95% of those deaths are occurring in Africa and Asia. And we'll talk about why that is on the next slide. Now, worldwide, rabies is not only devastating from a humanitarian standpoint, but also economically. The global burden of canine-mediated rabies alone is estimated to cost $8.6 billion. And that includes the cost of rabies post-exposure prophylaxis, travel, time off work, and other implications. But the good news is that with timely and appropriate post-exposure prophylaxis, rabies is a nearly 100% preventable disease. Now, I want to talk about the prevalence of rabies around the world and what we're seeing, which different animals we're seeing it in. These two graphs depict the differences in the occurrence of rabies according to the primary reservoir or virus variant. Shown on the graph on the left are the areas with the highest occurrence of canine-mediated rabies. This is because of a large population of stray and feral dogs in these countries, as well as mass under-vaccination of dogs. The high-risk countries where dog rabies is openly circulating are primarily in Africa and Asia. And as we talked about on the last slide, that's where we're seeing a lot of our deaths as well. That's because 99% of the cases of rabies that are transmitted to humans are due to dog bites. So you have this virus openly circulating in this large unmanaged population of dogs with a very low vaccination rate, and you can see that the potential for spillover to humans is really high. Now, I also want to point out on the map of canine rabies that Canada, the United States, and Mexico, this map's a little outdated, are all free of canine rabies. And that's really important because that's why the CDC has taken steps to suspend the importation of dogs from these high-risk countries, because we've had several incursions of dogs being brought over from the high-risk countries into the United States that are incubating rabies virus and then go on to develop rabies when they arrive in the United States. And this is how we could have a reintroduction of canine rabies back into the United States if we don't maintain our high vaccination levels that we have currently in our dog population. Now let's look at rabies here in the United States. Over the last 10 years, we've had 25 human cases of rabies. Typically, we have about 0 to 3 cases per year, but in one year we did have 7 people succumb to rabies. Now, 8 of those cases were due to bite contact outside of the United States. 13 of those cases were infected in the United States. And importantly, 10 of those people had known contact with or a bite from a bat. So that means that the most risky animal of transmitting rabies to people in the United States are bats. And that's why we take encounters with bats so much different than we handle them with dogs or our other domestic animals, is because they're just a much more risky species. 4 of those people had an unknown exposure. During that same time period, there was also 1 survivor of rabies. That was an 8-year-old girl who was scratched by a rabid cat on her school playground. And sadly, there was also 1 breakthrough infection and death. That was in an older gentleman who received timely and appropriate post-exposure prophylaxis, but had an underlying immunosuppressive condition that neither he nor his healthcare providers were aware of. Now, we go to great lengths to prevent rabies deaths here in the United States by administering 30 to 60,000 doses of post-exposure prophylaxis every year. So what are our rabies virus reservoirs here in the United States? They're going to vary by geographic region. Here in Kansas, we have the South Central skunk variant of rabies virus. So that means that rabies is openly circulating in the skunk population here in Kansas and most of the Great Plains. Up north, they have the North Central skunk variant. And you'll see different variants across the United States. On the East Coast, it's dominated by the raccoon variant, and in other locations, they have the fox variant or a mongoose variant down in Puerto Rico. What's not shown on this map are the bat rabies virus variants, and that is because it is distributed widely across the United States. So looking at the numbers in Kansas, in 2022, we tested 930 animals for rabies, which is pretty consistent with what we saw in 2021 and what we're on track to test for in 2023. The breakdown of those animals were 45% wildlife and 55% domestic animals, which again is pretty typical from year to year. Of those 930 animals that were tested, we had 17 positive, with 16 of those being in wildlife. And of our 16 positive wildlife, not surprisingly, 14 of them were skunks. So we had 14 positive skunks out of 43 total tested, which is just over 33% of our skunks testing positive. And that's important to know because it really informs risk. When we're seeing skunk and typically dog encounters, we have a really high suspicion for rabies because that's when we're seeing skunks attack dogs, is when they're rabid. On the other hand, we only had 2 positive bats out of 302 tested. So that's less than 1% of our bats that are testing positive. Now remember that bats are the most important species for transmitting rabies to humans. And that's what a majority of these encounters are bat-human encounters. We did have 1 domestic animal test positive, and that was a cat. We also tested 249 dogs, which again is really consistent with our typical yearly average, and none of those dogs were positive. So now let's take a look at the biology of the rabies virus. Rabies is a really neat virus, I think. It's a bullet-shaped RNA virus, and it has an affinity for the nervous system. So what does this mean? It means that the virus is found in the nerves and neural tissue and in the saliva. And that's important to know because if you have a blood exposure to a potentially rabid animal, that's not going to pose a risk for rabies transmission. The risk is really by the nerve tissue exposure and by saliva exposure, typically through a bite. Any mammal can be infected with rabies. And again, mammals are those animals that have fur and bear live young and produce milk. The other great thing about rabies is that it doesn't survive long in the environment. It's easily killed by sunlight, by your common household disinfectants, and by drying. Why is this important to know? Well, we get a lot of calls about typically cats dragging in dried up bats and people wanting to know what they need to worry about from a rabies perspective. And really the risk is extremely low because if that bat is dried up, even if it did have rabies, its brain is also dried up, rendering the virus ineffective for transmission. So it doesn't pose a rabies risk. Now I want to talk about how the virus is actually transmitted. And in this scenario, we're going to imagine a dog biting a person. So first we said that the virus is found in the saliva and neural tissue. So when a dog bites a person, the virus is in the saliva, it enters through the bite wound, and then it's going to replicate locally in the muscle tissue. And then, since it has an affinity for the nerves, it's going to look for the closest nerve, and we call those the peripheral nerves. They're the small nerves that innervate the skin, fingertips, toe tips, things like that. It's going to find that small nerve, and then from there, it's actually going to climb up the nerve. And it moves really slow, about a centimeter a day. So it's going to actually climb up that peripheral nerve until it gets to a very special spot called the dorsal root ganglion. That's in the spinal cord. And then from there, it's going to climb up the spinal cord until it reaches the brain. And then in the brain is when you start seeing clinical signs. So it causes inflammation in the brain. You start seeing a behavior change in a person or animal that's infected. And then the virus is going to be able to move to specific tissues like the kidneys and eyes. And that's how we get transplant-associated cases of rabies. And importantly, it's going to move to the salivary glands where it's ready to move on to its next host through another bite wound infection. So why is this important to know specifically how the virus is transmitted? Well, it's important because the time that it takes for the virus to reach the brain depends on the location of the bite. So the closer the bite is to the brain, say if you have a bite above the shoulders, that's going to be a much more risky situation than if you have a bite to the hand, the arm, the leg, because it's going to take a long time for that virus to climb up the nerve and reach the brain. So that's what gives us the ability to not only test animals for rabies and wait to administer post-exposure prophylaxis, but also to have that 10-day observation period, because we would not expect a person to develop rabies within 10 days of being bit by an animal if it's on the arm or the leg or one of those more distant sites from the brain. So now let's talk about what rabies looks like in humans. It starts out as a very nonspecific flu-like illness. People might have general malaise, fatigue, a headache, and general weakness or discomfort. It's also pretty common for people to report tingling or an itching sensation at the site of the bite. So if they're bitten by a bat on the finger, they might have a kind of a burning, itching feeling on their finger that kind of progresses up the arm and toward the shoulder. And then that is going to progress within a few days to the more typical form of rabies. As you get that brain inflammation, people are going to start experiencing anxiety, confusion. They might have hallucinations, and then often get paralysis of their muscles, which it ultimately leads to death through cardiorespiratory failure. There's also a percentage of people that get paralytic rabies. This is a much less dramatic course. It usually takes much longer for that person to succumb to rabies. And these are the cases that are more commonly misdiagnosed and again, contribute to the underreporting of the disease and also the possibility for transplant-associated cases. Now, comparing that to the clinical course in animals is actually fairly similar. Animals start with a prodromal phase. And these initial symptoms, again, are very nonspecific: lethargy, fever, vomiting, anorexia. During this phase, animals might start to exhibit a change in temperament. So friendly animals may become more shy or withdrawn, but you're not seeing these super aggressive animals in this prodromal phase. Within a few days, that's when the animals are going to progress to the excitement phase, or the furious form of rabies. And it's this period where the animals become suddenly agitated and restless. They might get the urge to roam, and then their behavior becomes vicious and erratic. And that's when they are most likely to transmit the virus to another person or animal, because they're going to be doing the biting behavior, lunging, again, very erratic. And they might also start showing neurologic symptoms like seizures, uncoordinated walking, and difficulty swallowing, as those muscles of the neck become paralyzed. And that's where we get the typical drooling animal form of rabies. And then finally is the paralytic period. And during that period is when animals might become weak in the limbs or the jaw. And this phase in large animals is commonly mistaken for choke. And that is when most people are exposed, is they believe their animal's choking and they'll try to look for something in their throat. And then death is going to, occur within a week or less of symptom onset. And again, that is where we get the basis for our 10-day observation. If an animal's biting a person because it's rabid, we would expect that animal to succumb to rabies in less than 10 days. So how do we diagnose rabies? This is performed at the Kansas State Veterinary Diagnostic Lab. They need 3 specific portions of the brain to be able to confirm or rule out rabies. So that's really important, because sometimes we will get an incomplete brain submitted for testing, and while they will be able to issue a positive result if rabies is present in one of those sections, they will not be able to issue a negative result without having all of the sections of that brain present. So that's really important. If you are a person who submits samples, we need the entire head and brain stem to be able to test for rabies. We also get the question a lot of who pays for the test. That is paid for by the bite victim or the animal owner. Unfortunately, the state health department does not have funds to pay for rabies virus testing. Some states do, Kansas does not. The local health department may or may not have the funds to pay for rabies testing. Most of them don't. So that's something that you're definitely going to want to call your local health department about. Kansas is a decentralized state, which means that the local health departments have the authority when it comes to preventing disease spread within their county, and rabies falls under that authority. All right, now let's go into vaccination for rabies. First, we'll start with humans. There is a pre-exposure vaccination series available for humans. It was recently updated last year to only be 2 injections, one at day 0 and one at day 7. And these pre-exposure vaccinations are recommended for people that are going to have a recognized risk of exposure. So typically we're thinking about our veterinary personnel, wildlife biologists, laboratorians who are working with the rabies virus, and then people whose extracurricular activities may put them at a risk for rabies exposure, like people who are into exploring caves. Another unique group of people that are typically pre-vaccinated are travelers that are going to those countries that are endemic for canine rabies, and they are expected to work with the local population. So we also might have animal control officers and shelter workers being pre-vaccinated because they're dealing with animals with an unknown history, whereas people who are working at boarding kennels or breeders wouldn't need pre-exposure vaccination because we wouldn't expect them to have that exposure. Now, for people who have been potentially exposed to rabies, we also have post-exposure prophylaxis. If you've already been vaccinated for rabies, that post-exposure prophylaxis is only 2 doses. Most people have not been vaccinated for rabies, so it's going to be a 5-dose series. The first vaccine is called human rabies immunoglobulin, and that is a preformed antibody that is injected in and around the bite wound, wherever that may happen to be. And then there's a series of 4 vaccines that are given over the next 2 weeks. And if we have a person who is immunocompromised, they are getting that 5th dose of vaccine given on day 28. Now, it's really important that we're only vaccinating people that have a real risk of rabies exposure or a known exposure, because the cost can be pretty variable. But in 2019, we did a study here in Kansas to look at the cost of rabies post-exposure prophylaxis, and it was estimated to be just over $9,000 per person, and that is only the cost of the biologics. So that doesn't include the hospital fee. That human rabies immunoglobulin is only available through emergency rooms, so it doesn't include the emergency room fee or other fees that might be associated with obtaining care, and it also does not include any wound care that would be necessary. So there is no financial support from the state or the local health department for those vaccines, but some vaccine companies do have programs. So if that is ever a concern, again, you would want to contact your local health department and they will be able to connect you with resources for post-exposure prophylaxis. Now let's look at the animal side of rabies vaccines. Unfortunately, Kansas is one of only a handful of states that does not have a statewide rabies vaccination law. There are 10 counties that require rabies vaccinations. And what's interesting is that it varies a lot within counties, whether it is only dogs that are required, or only dogs and cats, or dogs, cats, and ferrets. And then out in Barton County, we have dogs, cats, ferrets, and horses. So that's something that's going to vary by county. And then also there are a number of municipalities that do have rabies vaccine requirements. So again, it's important to be familiar with what your local statute is, because we don't have any type of statewide law. It is pretty variable. So for our vaccination for animals, you might be thinking, you know, we've eliminated canine rabies from the United States. You said that we test around 250 dogs every year and we're not getting positives. Why do we need to keep vaccinating our dogs? Well, it's important because the vaccination of our domestic animals not only protects them against these wildlife encounters that they may have, but it also provides a buffer between wildlife and people, so that you're not having these dogs getting in fights with skunks, developing rabies, and then exposing their owners or neighbors or other animals to rabies virus. So it's really important to keep up to date on vaccinations of our domestic animals as well. There are licensed rabies vaccines for dogs, cats, ferrets, horses, cattle, and sheep. And in Kansas, they must be given by or under the direct supervision of a veterinarian, and they're administered according to label direction. So there's 1-year vaccines, 2-year vaccines, and 3-year vaccines that are available. All right, so now let's get into the meat of it: animal bites and potential rabies exposures. Animal bites are incredibly common. It's estimated that about 4.5 million people are bitten by dogs each year in the United States, and that during one's lifetime, about 40% of people will be bitten by a dog. And again, most of our bite victims are children. Now, animal bites are not reportable to the state health department, but they are reportable in many local health departments. So again, if you have questions on animal bites or reporting animal bites, I would urge you to contact your local health department, because we really do see a wide variation in how those are handled. Some of them have really close follow-up with how they're dealing with animal bites. Some of them have a much more hands-off approach. So we're always here to answer questions, but as far as the actual process, that is going to vary by county and municipality and may or may not require direct public health action. So when we have an animal bite, we are conducting an exposure risk assessment. Say we're unable to test this animal and we need to know if this person requires post-exposure prophylaxis or not. During our exposure risk assessment, we're going to assess for the type of exposure and location of exposure. And then we're going to look at the biting animal species and a couple of different things to do with that biting animal. So I'll get into each of those on the next couple of slides. First, we're going to assess for our type of exposure. Most commonly, this is a bite exposure, which we define as any penetration of the skin by the teeth. And this is going to be a more high-risk exposure because, again, the virus is found in the saliva. So if an animal is biting, they are directly inoculating that virus into the wound. There are non-bite exposures. So this could be through an open wound or a mucous membrane. It could be through an abrasion. And with our wildlife and cats, we also consider scratches to be a potential source of exposure. Next, we're going to look at the location of exposure. And again, this is important because of how the virus is transmitted. It has to crawl up those nerves at a rate of only 1 centimeter per day. So if we have a high-risk exposure, say a bite wound to the face, that may require post-exposure prophylaxis to be started right away versus a bite wound to the hand, where we have more time to do our investigation, a 10-day observation period, or testing of that animal. Next, we're going to look at the species causing exposure, and this is for the biting animal. So I've got them separated into high, moderate, and low risk. And really that is because of, based on the epidemiology of rabies virus here in Kansas and what we are typically seeing. So our high-risk animals are going to be most of our wildlife and cats. And the reason that cats are high risk is because when we have rabid cats, very often people will not have a source of exposure for that cat. So there's not a history that the cat was bitten by a skunk or that the cat walked up with a bat in its mouth. It's just, this cat bit me. It's an outdoor cat. It's never been vaccinated. We recommend euthanasia and it tests positive. Our moderate risk animals are going to be dogs, ferrets, horses, and other livestock. And again, because we're not seeing the transmission from those animals into people, they're a very uncommon source of exposure to people, which makes them a moderate risk. And then our low risk animals are going to be rabbits and our small rodents and possums. And the small rodents we get a lot of calls about squirrel bites and chipmunk bites. And the reason that those animals are a low risk for rabies is because if they were bitten or attacked by a rabid animal, we would expect them to die from that attack or those bite wounds. They would not be able to survive the 3 to 4 weeks that it takes for that rabies virus to incubate, the animal to develop symptoms, and then those symptoms to cause the animal to bite a person. So it's a pretty rare scenario where we're recommending testing or post-exposure prophylaxis for small rodent bites. Now, I do want to talk about bat exposure separately because bats are a special scenario. We talked about they are the most common mammal to transmit rabies to humans here in the United States. So any type of bat exposure is going to be evaluated very closely because of, number one, the limited visible injury. On the picture on the bottom, in that circle is a person that was bitten by a bat 3 hours previously. And if it weren't for the circle around it, I think you would probably have a hard time seeing those bite wounds, especially the one on the lower part of the circle there, because it's practically invisible. And then the other thing that we have found through public health investigations over the years is that people tend to have a pretty inaccurate recall of bat encounters. You know, it's this very frenzied situation. Maybe you wake up to a bat in your room and it's flying around and you don't think it touched you, but maybe it did. And you don't really know when you captured it, what happened. So we are evaluating these exposures much more closely. And there are certain situations where we consider a person exposed no matter what. So if we have a person who is sleeping and they wake to find a bat in their room, unless they can catch and test that bat to eliminate the possibility of rabies, we're going to recommend post-exposure prophylaxis. Anytime a bat is found in a room with an unattended child or a mentally disabled person or an intoxicated person. And then I'll also add a pet on there. Anytime a bat is found in the room with an unattended pet, those are all going to be considered rabies exposures. The next thing when we're doing our risk assessment, we're looking at normal versus abnormal behavior. So if we think about the way that rabies affects an animal, it causes inflammation of the brain, and that's what causes the behavior changes. So oftentimes we're getting calls about provoked bites. An animal is eating and a child comes over and sticks their hand in the food bowl. That's a provoked bite. That's not a rabid animal biting a child. That is a normal response to an abnormal situation. Or playing with a sleeping dog or pulling its tail or something like that. Those are all provoked bites, and they have a much lower index of suspicion than unprovoked bites, which would be out of character for that animal and indicative of a behavior change. Next, we're looking together at the vaccination and health status of an animal. A currently vaccinated animal is very unlikely to develop rabies, even with an exposure. So currently vaccinated animals have a very low degree of suspicion, as do out-of-date animals, because again, that rabies vaccine is really pretty effective. So we're not seeing animals with a history of recent vaccination developing rabies. Now, if we don't know the vaccination history of that animal, or we know that it's never been vaccinated, then our suspicion is going to be a little bit higher. If the animal appears healthy or owned, pretty low suspicion of rabies. If it appears mangy or injured or unkept, those are things that would be a higher index of suspicion. So if we have an animal like this in the picture who doesn't look owned, it looks like it hasn't been well cared for, and it bites a person, that's going to be a higher index of suspicion than our healthy looking golden retriever here. So when we have a rabid animal, they're tested at the diagnostic lab, and then that report is sent over to the state health department. Every day we get the reports of all positives and negatives in the state of Kansas. If we have a positive animal, then the state health department is going to call the local health department, because they are the ones that have the authority over rabies in their county. From there, the local health department is going to call the veterinarian who submitted the animal for testing, and they're also going to call the person who is on the form as being potentially exposed. And from there, the local health department is going to conduct that exposure risk assessment that we just went through. They are going to make PEP recommendations for any humans that may have been exposed, and then they're going to give management options for any animals that may have been exposed. So for our humans, if they are exposed to a known rabid animal, it's really important to get wound treatment, because bite wound infections are incredibly common, especially with cat bites. We're going to want to make sure that person is current on their tetanus vaccine, and then administering rabies post-exposure prophylaxis if it's indicated, either based on testing results or based on our exposure risk assessment. Now, that exposure risk assessment has a lot that goes into it. And we do get a lot of calls about animal bites, especially dog bites. And so we have developed an online rabies risk assessment algorithm. So if you go to the KDHE rabies webpage, over there on the right-hand side, you'll see rabies exposure assessment. And if you click on that, it will take you to this page. And this is for humans that were bitten by an animal. And you can go through these different questions to see if post-exposure prophylaxis is indicated for your animal bite. So I'm going to walk through a scenario here, and we'll go with a dog bite. So first, it asks you if there is an exposure. And if you're unsure what an exposure is, we have a link out there to the CDC webpage that discusses the potential different types of exposures. So we'll say, yes, there was. Importantly, this is based on our information that we have in Kansas. So the next question is asking about if the exposure occurred in the state of Kansas. If it didn't, then you'll want to call our epidemiology hotline so you can get more specific guidance based on that. So for this one, we're going to say, yes, it occurred in the state of Kansas, and the type of animal causing the exposure was a dog. Next, it asks if the animal was showing signs that were suggestive of rabies, such as excessive drooling or staggering, or these behavior changes. And we're going to say no. It appeared to be a healthy dog. We were just out on a walk, and this dog came up and bit me. It was in the lawn with a person, and then the person didn't know anything about it. So next, we're going to ask, was this bite provoked? And in this scenario, we'll say, yes, it was provoked. You were walking by their lawn and stopped to look at their flowers, and the dog did not like that because you were on their territory, so it came up and bit you. So in this scenario, PEP would not be recommended, because that's a normal behavior for a dog. We're not seeing rabies openly circulating in our dog population. This is an owned, apparently healthy dog that bit a person on the dog's own property. So PEP would not be recommended in that scenario. Now let's turn this around a little bit and say it was a cat. And this cat is not showing symptoms of rabies. It seemed to be a perfectly healthy cat. We just decided to pet it. Is the cat available for observation or testing? So let's just say you were at a park, you saw a cat, you decided to pet it, the cat bit you and ran away. That cat's not available for observation or testing. So in that case, we would recommend post-exposure prophylaxis. And again, that's based on the information that we have in the past on rabies in cats. Rabies in cats is usually not due to a known exposure. We're not typically seeing it in owned cats. We're seeing it in outdoor cats. And it's pretty common for them to just bite a person on the hand, and that's the only interaction. It's not this aggressive type of attack. Now, if the animal had been available for observation and testing, say you have some outdoor cats that you feed, they're not your cats, you just like to put food out for them, and one day one of them bit you, but they come back pretty reliably every day so you can observe it, then in that case, we would want to wait for the outcome of testing or the outcome of observation before we recommend starting rabies PEP. Or you could also choose to have that animal tested for rabies. But the key here is that this animal is available, so we have those options to take, and PEP is not an emergency. All right, now let's talk about our animals that are exposed to rabies and our different options for managing those animals. First, we'll start with definitions. I want to go over observation. Observation is a 45-day period. Typically, this is going to be under the owner's control, and we are monitoring for any changes in behavior that are consistent with rabies infection. Our other term is quarantine. This is a 4 to 6 month time period, and this location is determined by the local health officer. Because again, the local health department are the people that have authority over the management of rabies in their location. Oftentimes, this will be at the owner's residence. Sometimes they may be required at a veterinary premise or a pound or shelter. It really just depends on the situation. Quarantine is different than observation in that quarantine requires the physical confinement of the animal during the specified time period when it's monitored for the development of disease. So as it's written in our rabies control requirements, it means that the animal's need for ambient temperature control, water, nutrition, elimination, and a space to comfortably stand up and lie down must be provided for. The animal shall not be permitted to leave or be taken off the property for any reason except for veterinary care, and the contact with other animals is prohibited and contact with people is minimized. And we'll talk about why there's that distinction here in the next couple of slides. So for our animals that are currently vaccinated, and these are ones in which we have a labeled vaccine, so dogs, cats, ferrets, horses, cattle, and sheep, they need an immediate, and they're exposed to rabies, say they're bitten by a skunk. They need an immediate booster, so we define immediate as within 96 hours, and then because they're currently vaccinated, they are observed for 45 days. So that's why we have the less strict protocol for them, is because they are currently vaccinated. And if they get that booster within 96 hours, we would expect that to be sufficient to prevent rabies. We also get questions about what does a current vaccine mean? It's different depending on which vaccine the animal is vaccinated for. So it could be any time from the last year to the last 3 years. But current means that it must be given at least 28 days prior to exposure if it's the initial vaccine. So if you have a puppy who's getting vaccinated and it's bitten by a skunk 2 weeks after it got its vaccine, it is not considered currently vaccinated. If it's bitten 5 weeks after its vaccine, then it is considered currently vaccinated. For every booster vaccine after that, the animal is considered current on the day it gets its vaccine. So even if it's 3 months overdue, it gets its rabies vaccine, it is considered current on that day of vaccination. For our animals that are out of date with their vaccination, as long as we have appropriate documentation, then they also just get that 96-hour booster and a 45-day observation. Now, if that booster is delayed, sometimes we may extend the observation period, It's really dependent on the situation. If we don't have appropriate documentation, say you got a pet from somebody else and they told you that it was currently vaccinated, but you don't have proof of that, we have the option to do prospective serologic monitoring, which will tell us if the animal has been vaccinated or not, or we can treat it as an unvaccinated animal. Our unvaccinated animals are going to be the ones that are the highest risk for developing rabies after a rabies exposure. So they are going to have the 4-month quarantine that has the much stricter measures, because if they do develop rabies, we don't want them exposing another animal or a lot of people to rabies. So again, they're going to get that 96-hour booster, and we do have a post-exposure prophylaxis protocol for animals. It's going to be a series of 3 vaccines. That first one, which is our 96-hour booster, is day 0, and then a second vaccine on day 7, and a third vaccine between day 21 and 28. This post-exposure prophylaxis protocol is very heavily used in areas where they have a higher rate of rabies in their wildlife animals, and it is very effective. Our other option is to euthanize. So I'd really encourage you, if quarantine is possible, to do that post-exposure prophylaxis for an unvaccinated exposed animal. So just a quick summary. Our currently vaccinated animals get that 96-hour booster and a 45-day observation. Our out-of-date animals get a 96-hour booster and a 45-day observation with proof of vaccination. And again, if they don't have that proof, we can do the prospective serologic monitoring. Our unvaccinated animals are going to get the 96-hour booster and the KSU PET protocol with a 4 to 6 month quarantine or euthanasia. Now, how do we manage the animals that are causing the exposure? So these are the ones who are biting people. How do we manage them? For bites of an owned dog, cat, or ferret, it's a 10-day observation. Pretty straightforward. If it is a stray animal or an unclaimed dog, cat, or ferret, as it's written in our rabies requirements, that animal should be euthanized and tested. Now, depending on the scenario, I think it's okay to observe that animal if that's possible. If the animal is otherwise looks healthy, but it's a stray, it's completely fine to observe it for 10 days instead of euthanizing and testing it. If it is a stray animal, excuse me, that doesn't look healthy or it's having neurologic signs, then it should be euthanized and tested. For our non-bite exposures, again, that's primarily a concern with cats and wildlife, and we are handling those on a case-by-case basis. So during this 10-day observation period, typically we're going to wait to administer post-exposure prophylaxis to a person, unless it's a high-risk exposure, which it would be one above the shoulders. We do not want to vaccinate the animal that did the biting during this observation period, because if it has a vaccine reaction, that could be confused for signs of rabies. The location of the 10-day observation is determined by the local health officer. Sometimes this may be allowed to happen at home. Sometimes it's going to be at a veterinary facility or a pound or a shelter. If the animal develops rabies, are signs that are suggestive of rabies during this time period, it's euthanized and tested. If it's alive at the end of 10 days, it does not have rabies, and at that time, if it's not current, it needs to be vaccinated. All right, let's get into some scenarios to drive some of these things home that we've been talking about this morning. So first, we're going to go with an exposed animal. So we have a 3-year-old dog that is in the pen with a skunk. The skunk was never tested for rabies. We'll say the owner shot it, I'm sorry, but it shot it in the head, so we're unable to test it. The dog is overdue for its vaccine, its rabies vaccine, but it has been vaccinated once in its life, and it does have documentation of that vaccine. So the next course of action for this dog is going to be to administer the 96-hour booster and then observe it for 45 days. So we've got an out-of-date dog that has proof. So we just need that 96-hour booster and a 45-day observation. Next, we have a 6-month-old puppy. It's found in a pen with a positive skunk. It was vaccinated 14 days ago with its first vaccine, and it does have documentation of that. So we know that it has an exposure. So the first thing is going to be to booster it within 96 hours. But is this dog considered currently vaccinated? It is not, because its first vaccine was only 14 days ago, and it needs to be 28 days from that initial vaccine for it to be considered currently vaccinated. So that dog is going to require the KSU PEP protocol and a 4-month quarantine. The other option would be euthanasia. Now we'll look at animals causing the exposure. So let's say we have a 12-year-old owned dog. It bites a person. It's an indoor residential dog. It's been vaccinated throughout its entire life. It was a provoked bite. So in this scenario, we would not recommend a 10-day observation for this dog because there is no risk of rabies exposure. It was a provoked bite. It's a vaccinated dog. It's an owned dog. No need to do the 10-day observation. Next, we have a 5-year-old owned dog who bites a person. This is an outdoor dog that lives in the country. It was vaccinated once in its life, but it's now out of date with its vaccine. It was an unprovoked bite, and this dog is showing abnormal behavior. So in this situation, we have a couple of things that are raising a red flag. Number one, it's an outdoor dog that lives in the country. So it's got that access to wildlife, especially skunks, which are the most common animal to expose other animals to rabies. It's out of date with its rabies vaccination. It was an unprovoked bite, and this dog is also showing abnormal behavior. So in that scenario, we would recommend a 10-day observation. And if that dog is alive at the end of 10 days, the person does not need rabies post-exposure prophylaxis. We'll do a couple more scenarios with the animal causing the exposure. So this time we have a stray cat that bites a person. We don't know anything about its vaccination history or its typical behavior because it's a stray cat. It did seem like it was a provoked bite. Now in this scenario, because it's a stray, we are going to recommend euthanasia and rabies testing. In the next scenario, we have an owned cat that bites a person. It's an indoor-outdoor cat that's never been vaccinated for rabies, and it was a provoked bite. Again, we have a couple of things that are raising a flag. Number one, it does have access to the outdoors, so it does have a potential rabies exposure interaction with wildlife. Number two, it's never been protected against rabies. So in this scenario, because it's an owned cat, we're going to recommend a 10-day observation. So in summary, I know those terms can get a little tricky. So for animals that are causing the exposure, animals doing the biting, they get a 10-day observation period because the clinical course of rabies would be expected to kill that animal within 10 days. Versus an animal that is exposed to rabies is getting either a 45-day observation or a 4 to 6 month quarantine based on its current rabies vaccination status. So if you suspect rabies or you have questions about observation or quarantine, please do not hesitate to call either your local health department or KDHE. We have a 24/7 epidemiology hotline where someone is available on rabies consultations. So again, my overall recommendations would be to call your state or local health department for any suspect rabies cases. We have that 24-hour hotline that we're always available. Since we are a decentralized state and it's home rules, you need to be familiar with your city, county, and local laws on rabies vaccination, confinement, and quarantine. If you work with unknown animals on a regular basis, you should protect yourself and your staff from potential exposures by having written protocols and training staff on vaccine principles and what to do in the scenario of animal bites and scratches. I have a couple of references here that you might find helpful. Our rabies control requirements is a great document. It's a 12-page PDF document that goes through what to do in all of these different situations, and it's super useful to have bookmarked. We also have our animal bite algorithm that I went through. We have a lot of resources on our KDHE Rabies website. And then I also wanted to provide you with our local health department directory. I know it's not very useful to say call your local health department and then not have a way to call them. So that local health department directory is really great and gives you the numbers to call. And some of our larger health departments also have 24/7 hotlines. And then we have some national resources that are really useful too. The Compendium of Animal Rabies Prevention goes through what to do in different exposure scenarios. And the CDC has a lot of great resources, especially about rabies in other parts of the world and for travelers. So thank you so much for your time this morning. Sorry about my throat. And at this time, I'd love to take any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Petro. What terrific information that you've provided us today. I do have a couple questions that have come in. You mentioned right at the very end about your local health department with it, city, county with it. Where should that first call go? Should it go to the county health department to find out if they're responsible, or the city? What is your suggestion on what that first call should be?
I would say to the county health department, especially if it's a concern about a human being bitten by an animal or even an animal being exposed to rabies, because they are typically the person or the group that's going to facilitate animal testing. Say you wake up to find a bat in your room and you're not sure what to do with it. They can help coordinate testing of that animal through you. So they have a lot of different resources, and oftentimes they'll have relationships with the local animal control as well.
Great. I did have a question about how do you talk to children about this? You've done a great job to an adult audience today, but we're winding down now with the fall, but young people are maybe going back out in the spring, et cetera, or in those nice days, fall and winter. How do you talk to our youth about what's that first step or that first conversation?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And one of the things that we really try to push is to educate your children or youth about interactions with wildlife. We do see deaths in children from rabies, from playing with bats is the most common. They don't realize that there's a risk of rabies from bats. And then unfortunately, a lot of kids end up having to go through post-exposure prophylaxis because of playing with baby wild animals. So picking up a baby raccoon or picking up a baby coyote, those are all bite questions that we've gotten in the last year. And unfortunately, either those animals have to be tested or the children have to go through post-exposure prophylaxis. And that's actually one thing that we are really working on with the diagnostic lab is increasing the awareness of rabies among youth. So this year we actually have a poster competition that we're doing for children in grades K through 12 to develop a poster on rabies prevention. And we have some really great prizes for these kids. We started it on World Rabies Day, which was on September 28th, and the competition goes throughout the fall. So you can find more information on that on our website and on the VDL website.
Thank you very much for that. We have a question coming in here on the chat. It states that in Olathe, they have had 2 bats test positive in the last month.
Yes.
The person wants to know, is there any precautions or added protocols that should be added?
Yeah, so we are seeing more bats being tested. This is the time of year when we see more bats being submitted overall and being tested and can end up positive. And that's because of the natural behavior cycle of the bats. This is when they are coming out of those roosting colonies and out of the maternity colonies, and they're doing a lot more flying around. And so that's when people tend to have more interactions with them, or animals have interactions with them. And so that's how we get that exposure. So this is actually the ideal time of year to check your house, especially the attics, the fascia, anywhere where you have a potential gap. Chimneys are another huge area that we see bats coming down chimneys, and seal up those gaps so that the bats can come back in there and roost. And that's what we really try to tell people is this is the perfect time of year to seal up all those cracks, crevices, and entry points into your house. Because when it starts getting into winter, or especially the springtime frame, is when we start seeing more bat activity again. And bats are protected species. So if they're not in the living quarters, you're not going to be able to relocate them until the fall.
Great. We've had one final question come in to us that stated that we've heard about that there was a kitten in Nebraska that was recently diagnosed with rabies. So can you tell us what's the significance of this event, or maybe what's different about this case?
Yeah, absolutely. So this kitten, it just came out last week. This kitten was infected with the raccoon variant of rabies. And if you'll remember back to the beginning of this presentation, I talked about our different rabies virus reservoirs. And we have not seen raccoon rabies virus west of the Appalachian Mountains ever. USDA has a really intensive oral rabies vaccination protocol for raccoons. So they drop thousands and thousands of oral rabies vaccine baits this time of year and into the spring along the Appalachian Trail. And that's to keep rabies, or raccoon variant rabies, east, so that it's concentrated in that area. Here we have skunk rabies. So our cat that tested positive last year had skunk variant of rabies. Very common. The problem with raccoon variant is that, number one, we don't see it here. So we don't want another rabies virus reservoir in this part of the country. Number two, raccoon variant rabies is much more easily transmitted among animal to animal than skunk variant is. And number three, our skunks, we're primarily seeing those interactions in more rural areas. Raccoons live in rural and urban areas, so you see a lot more raccoon person interaction and raccoon animal interaction than you do with the skunks, which also makes it a lot easier to transmit from the raccoons to people. So we really don't want that to become enzootic in our area.
Great. We have 2 minutes left, and we had one more question get submitted. And it says, scenario is that you have a suspect skunk or cat that you can't catch for observation. You stated in your presentation, you prefer not to shoot them because it's harder to have that testing done. Is there a suggested method to catch or euthanize them for testing?
Yeah, so if it's a skunk, you can definitely shoot them. You just want to do it in the chest. You don't want to shoot them in the head. So you should get a really quick, easy kill by shooting them in the chest, and that will preserve any brain material that we need for testing. For a cat, a live trap would work really great if you can bait a live trap to catch them. Or if it's a cat that you see, like it's one that you feed or it's a neighborhood cat, often we'll just recommend observation. So you don't need to see that cat every single day, but at the end of 10 days, if you can confirm that that cat's still alive, then we're not worried about it having rabies.
Well, great. Dr. Thomason, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Hey, yeah, I just want to thank you, Dr. Petro, for being here and sharing your time and expertise with us. So thank you, and everyone have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.